Tooker Gomberg, by the way, I think a round of applause for burning his Canadian passport due to climate change positions in Bonn. Okay. So why on science? This is something I'm going to go over fairly, I don't know if I can go over it quickly, but I think we need to understand where the global scientific community is right now. I have an uneasy sense, we were talking about it at our table over dinner, that the things that Canadians accept as understood, certainly things the Canadian government accepts as understood and agreed upon by all reasonable people, are things that are regarded as too difficult to talk about in much of the United States. I have that feeling. So I want to go over it just a bit and encourage those of you who are interested in pursuing it. Obviously, there's good website material on the Sierra Club on the US side of the website. Just to let you know that the Sierra Club website also has a Canadian page. And much of what I'm going to review with you, we have available on what I put outside as well in paper copies, the 10 top myths of climate change science and the 10 top myths about the Kyoto Protocol. So you can pick those up as well. What we know right now comes from a process which is extraordinary in the history of the world in terms of having a UN-mandated body that started meeting even before Rio, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has pulled together 2,000 or so scientists, all of whom have been appointed by their governments. Now, most of you know all this. These scientists are only reviewing those things that have come out through peer-reviewed journals. So the evidence that they look at to assess where we are on climate change science doesn't come sort of from the ether. It has to have gone through its own accountability, rigorous process, and the peer-reviewed journals in that sense then reflect not just the work of the handful of scientists that each scientist may be reviewing. So it's more than 2,000 scientists. It's probably, tens, at least 10,000 scientists whose work is involved in developing the consensus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from now on I'll call it the IPCC, works by consensus. Now this is tough. These guys are appointed by their government, not by Sierra Club. They get together, yes, that would have been nice, but they're not the most radical people that you can find, in other words. And by definition, what they're going to recommend is going to be fairly mainstream, conservative, accepted science. They rule out certain things. For instance, there's a lot of work in the published scientific literature that says that if the Western Arctic ice sheet is based on a doubling of CO2 atmospheric concentrations, the Western Antarctic ice sheet would fall and break away from Antarctica with the effect of a global 6-meter sea level rise. Now, there's peer-reviewed scientific views that say that that could happen. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has decided that on balance they don't think that will happen. So they're looking at, and I'm not criticizing them for this, I'm just giving you a sense of what they rule out. That we're looking at, if we hit 2 times CO2 in our atmosphere, a 1-meter sea level rise. Now, what does 2 times CO2 mean, and why is that what we're using as an indicator? It's sort of arbitrary in some ways. It's just that the climate modeling, which started back in the late 80s and early 90s, decided to pick a point at which they could start measuring what happens. I mean, it takes about 2 years to run some of these climate models. They're so intricate, they feed in so many variables, that they wanted to say, well, what happens if we double CO2? So another really important point about science and the projections for what will happen if we don't change the course we're on are not worst-case scenarios. This is a point that doesn't come through in the media much at all, is that all the projections for what happens at 2 times CO2 are based on just that. What happens if atmospheric concentrations double? There is absolutely nothing about our atmosphere or our use of fossil fuels that suggests that when we got to a doubling, we will have hit some kind of ceiling and the atmospheric concentrations will halt there. There is every possibility if the Bush-Cheney energy plan is not stopped, but we will shoot right past a doubling. And the modeling on tripling and quadrupling is stuff we don't want to know about right now, but it's much scarier than the IPCC consensus of what happens at a doubling. Now, what are we talking about? Where do we start from? We start from pre-industrial revolution atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. And before the Industrial Revolution, the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere was what might, a planetary Goldilocks might say, perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, we got it just right. It took 3.8 billion years for the planet to get its atmosphere just right to support life. And without the natural, and you all know this, without the natural greenhouse effect, the planet would be too cold to support life. That natural greenhouse effect happens at levels of CO2 that are surprisingly small. 275 parts per million carbon dioxide is what makes this planet warm enough to support life. We know that that level has been roughly the same going back at least 160,000 years through direct measurement. Now, how can we possibly have had direct measurement going back 160,000 years? We do it through carbon dating Antarctic ice cores and finding air pockets, and then you find out how much CO2 was in an air pocket that's 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, so on, back to 160,000 years. And it varies a bit, but it was relatively stable in the range of 275, 300, that was the peak. We're now at about 360. We are at 31% more CO2 than at any time in the last 160,000 years. And if you go from indirect measurement for things like snail shells and other fossils and so on and estimate the CO2, we are at levels that are actually 30% higher than anything in the last 20 million years. So people who say, gee, the weather changes all the time, why are these people going on about it? We have a pretty strong record of both indirect temperature measurements going back a million or so years, and of direct and indirect measures of CO2 going back. We know we're having a profound impact, and the IPCC says very clearly we know that impact is due to two things. The largest of the two things is fossil fuel burning. The other is deforestation. Now, 2 times CO2 is 550 parts per million. And the IPCC's earliest year at which they think that might happen is somewhere as soon as 2030, but most projections see it further out there. Okay. What happens if we hit a 2 times CO2? This is the range of projections you hear most of the time. We could see as much as a 4 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase. Doesn't sound like a lot to a lot of people, because they think, well, gee, winters in Canada are minus 40, summers are plus 40, so 4 degrees. And the key thing that I like people to say, this is the factoid, lock it in your head for when you're arguing with somebody about this. The difference between the temperature on planet Earth now and the global average temperature in the last ice age was 5 degrees Celsius. These are huge differences we're talking about. They're really large, and they're happening in a very, very, very short period of time. The other things that could happen, I mentioned sea level rise. Again, the IPCC consensus is that we might see a 1 meter sea level rise, might be more. What does that mean for the United States, for instance? I was sitting on the floor of the United Nations in the General Assembly when Bill Clinton gave the response from the United States to the 5 years after Rio. So this is his statistic, 4,000 square miles of the United States would be underwater. I wonder what would happen if Al-Qaeda had such ambitious plans for the coastline of the United States. I think we'd see some action to respond to the threat. In any case, much of the United States would be in states of permanent or semi-permanent drought. The Arctic, the North Pole, the Arctic ice would become a seasonal phenomenon, not permanent ice cover. At 2 times CO2, the Hague Meteorological Center of the United Kingdom sees the northern Amazon flipping from rainforest to desert. This is 2 times CO2. These are consensus projections. These are not worst case. So avoiding CO2 doubling is the goal of all the negotiations that have happened. So I'm going to shift now from, well, maybe I shouldn't shift from science quite yet. One of the things in the third assessment report of the IPCC that I think people should be thinking about at least, but not thinking about too much because it gets you really depressed, and I think the bar should open up and offer free drinks as I go on, because this stuff gets critical. The IPCC sub, and this is because greenhouse gases are long-lived in the atmosphere, so the carbon dioxide we emit now is with us for about 100 years. Now, we all know that what we're doing with Kyoto, we all know, Canada's commitment, the US commitment, the global, if the US was still in it, the industrial world commitment was to reduce our carbon dioxide levels on average, all industrialized countries in, by about 5% below where they were in 1990. Canada's commitment is 6, the US commitment was 7. What does that do in terms of avoiding a doubling? The most recent IPCC report, and this is not meant to disempower you or make you feel that Kyoto makes no difference, but the difference Kyoto makes is delaying the doubling by 6 to 10 years. Okay? What kind of reductions are needed, and this is where the catalyst comes in for all the changes we need in energy policy. What kind of reductions are needed to avoid a doubling? The IPCC reports that 70% below 1990 levels of CO2 are required globally to avoid a doubling. They also report that if we were to achieve 70% reductions in CO2 emissions tomorrow, it would take 100 years for atmospheric concentrations of CO2 to stabilize once again at some level that remains as steady as what 275 was before. It won't obviously return to 275 parts per million. We are in for significant climate change and warming. We're already seeing the impacts from what happens at 30% more than what we had before the Industrial Revolution. And we're stuck with at least that. I think that's what most scientists would say. But what happens is that it takes about 100 years for that to stabilize. It takes more than 100 years for temperature rise to stop. And it takes more than 1,000 years for sea level rise to stop. Now, the sea level rise, when it stops, will stop at a level below what they project could happen at 2 times CO2, but it just gives us, I think, a humbling sense of where our policy is right now in relation to what we're doing to the planet and future generations. Now, why does Kyoto matter as a matter of policy? Well, it took us an awful long time to get to mandated reductions in the use of fossil fuels in industrialized countries. The Rio Agreement struck in '92, which the US has signed and ratified, Canada has signed and ratified. The US is still a party in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol is a product of those negotiations after Rio. Everybody involved in the Framework Convention on Climate Change is a party. The conferences of the parties developed the Kyoto Protocol. The 1997 conference, which came up with mandated emission reduction targets to a schedule and a deadline, was negotiated in Kyoto, Japan, and that's why it's called the Kyoto Protocol. I think in hindsight, the next protocol should be negotiated in Houston. Because I think if it were the Houston Protocol, instead of a funny Japanese name, we'd be better off. It would not be. People have trouble saying Kyoto. You notice that? Kyoto. Ed Bush has a hard time with that one. So, policy. Why does Kyoto matter? Kyoto is flawed, no question. Canada played a despicable role, that's why Tooker burned his passport, in getting things that our government calls flexibility mechanisms. The Canadians know about this in the room. The flexibility mechanisms we also call loopholes. Things like we can buy Russian hot air, we can get credit for our trees as sinks. We're still trying to get an unbelievable loophole that we're never going to get. We want to get, believe it or not, clean energy export credits, because now the U.S. is out of the Kyoto Protocol, we want to claim credit for the natural gas we sell you on the theory that it might displace some coal. But given the Cheney-Bush energy plan, anything we send is going to be burned and all the coal too, so it doesn't really get you anywhere. But even with all the things that are wrong with Kyoto, and even though it delays doubling by 6 years, the reason it's indispensable is that it's one step. The next step in the negotiations, and why, you hear of course this was I think there were focus groups held in the United States to get the argument together for the US Senate that Kyoto was flawed because developing countries weren't in it. Well, the United States was part of the negotiations with everyone else who decided the way to make the process of reductions work was to do more or less what we did with the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, is start with the rich countries who caused the problem. Get them to reduce pollution first, develop the technologies that replace the things that were, in that case, destroying the ozone layer, and the rest of the world could catch up because they're poor and the transfer of technologies could occur. And as the President of the United States that I really want, that we will all watch on TV every Wednesday night, Jay Bartlett, the real one, okay, in the White House down there in West Wing, as he said, why should a nation of people driving SUVs insist on a nation of people riding bicycles to make reductions first? I was very pleased to hear good climate change policy coming out of West Wing. I don't know. I was going to ask, how did George Bush ever get elected? But then I remember he wasn't. So, anyway, so for all of how Kyoto is flawed, we've got to get past getting ratification of Kyoto and get it to enter into force so we get to the next stage of the negotiations, which are the deeper cuts for industrialized countries, and developing nations come on board. Where are we on ratification? Well, as Debbie very helpfully already pointed out, 4% of the population of the world in the United States produces 25% of the greenhouse gases. This has a major impact, not just on the science of the loading of the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, this has a big impact on the policy around Kyoto. Because in Kyoto, Japan, and as you know, every international treaty has its own ratification formula. Because you sign it, then nations have to ratify it, and then the treaty enters into force when enough countries ratify it to make it legally binding on all parties. The Kyoto ratification formula is 55 nations must ratify, and those 55 nations must be equivalent to 55% of the carbon dioxide emissions in 1990. So when Bush walked away, he took a lot of the board home with him because 25% of emissions walked out of the ratification formula. To get to 55% emissions, where are we right now? So far, 97 countries have ratified Kyoto. And as soon as Russia and Canada ratify, we'll have the 55% without y'all. So we still need you. But I mean, this is a political miracle when you think about it. That the protocol could enter into force because of the European Union, Japan, Russia, and even though Canada's emissions globally are small, we're only 3% of world emissions, we are per capita, I'm proud to say, just as much a polluting force as any American out there. We are per capita just as wasteful of energy as any of the American states. So we hold up our own. And this is, but in terms of emissions globally, the fact that Canada's 3% even matters in the ratification formula is something that never would have occurred to us at the time. Where are we in Canada in terms of policy? Our Prime Minister has committed. Now, Canada is not like the US. I was explaining over dinner some friends here, because you think about the Congress and something might be tabled and do you have enough votes? A Prime Minister with a majority government is a dictator, okay? There's not going to be a free vote on this, okay? This is going to pass. The Kyoto Protocol is going to go to the Parliament of Canada this fall for a vote. The Prime Minister has said it will be ratified. Unless the horrible campaign that we're now seeing from the government of Alberta and the industry lobby, which is I've never seen anything like it in Ottawa. I've never seen the barrage of pressure, never seen so many well-heeled lobbyists knocking over so many bureaucrats. They've already caused some of the foundations within government to start getting shaky because they've put such a huge response out there, and they're trying to erode the strongest reason that we will get Kyoto ratified in Canada, and that's Canadian public opinion. We have worked in Canada, environmental groups, across the country through the Climate Action Network and Keith and Bruce and all of the folks from other groups that are also Sierra Club buddies around here. We've worked together very, very strongly to keep a focus on why we have to move forward, limit our emissions, ratify Kyoto, so that Canadian public opinion is roughly 80% in favor of ratification. This includes, by the way, the labor union that represents the workers in the tar sands of northern Alberta. It includes the Canadian Auto Workers Union. It includes the Canadian Labour Congress. It includes all of our church groups, all faiths. It includes the Canadian Federation of Canadian Municipalities that did hold a free vote at their convention, and all the mayors and municipal councillors who were there at the national gathering of municipalities voted by 83% for ratification of Kyoto, including at least one councillor from the city of Alberta. We have support across the country. We will get Kyoto ratified. We can't afford to be complacent about it, however. So Canadians in the audience, we still need to get out those letters to the editor every time we see some insane piece by Rex Murphy or John Ibbotson or any of those columnists who rant about Kyoto. Get your letters in and respond. The other reason that climate change will drive policy on this, I mean, it's very easy to see. For me, it's easy to see how we get to 70% reductions of CO2 globally. We did two things. We get rid of coal plants and we get rid of the internal combustion engine. We're done. It's a short list. So how do we get there? Solutions are at hand. Through the Climate Action Network and the David Suzuki Foundation, we jointly commissioned a study which we released on Wednesday. It's called Kyoto and Beyond. It's a strategy for meeting Kyoto targets and more. Before I tell you about it, what's in it, I'll just tell you about what a treat it was that when we launched this, we brought up a U.S. industrialist. I recommend him to all of you. Get him into your legislators. Have him speak publicly as much as you can get your hands on him. If you haven't, you probably do know of him because you're all from a lot of you from the States. But his name's Ray Anderson. He's the CEO of Interface Flooring. I don't know if any of you have ever heard him speak. My God, he's powerful. He's very clear. He understands the issues. And he was able to say how much more money his company was making because they decided to move towards zero ecological footprint from their operations as a $1 billion a year company. He talked about how they figured out that if they reduced the weight of their floor covering by 1 ounce per square foot, they saved enough upstream embedded energy to run their plant for 2 years. He talked about all their strategies that, he's just lovely in Atlanta accent, saying, every time you fly 4,000 miles, you've got to think about the greenhouse gas. You've got to plant a tree every time. And then in 200 years, you'll be even. I think it helps people recognize what their personal accountability is around the choices we all make. So Ray Anderson came up to Ottawa, helped us launch this. He talked to a lot of MPs. And the study was written by Ralph Torrey, who's one of Canada's energy analysts, very prominent. And Kyoto and Beyond tells us this. As Debbie told you already, between 1970 and now, not just the United States, which is yours, all the industrialized countries, all the OECD countries, including Canada, in that period of time, found more energy through energy productivity improvements, energy efficiency and conservation than all new coal, oil, nukes, you name it, all combined. And that's true right across the board for industrialized countries. So the premise of this study was, since that happened and we weren't even trying, what would happen if we tried? What would happen if we set out to find all those places where energy productivity improvements were possible, and we went out like prospectors, we found them, we developed them, what happens? What happens, and this is a strategy for Canada, but I think that the lessons will hold true for the US, it's pretty exciting. The base year here is to end by 2030 with 50% reductions in CO2. By 2030, on this plan, which uses nothing but on-the-shelf available technologies, focusing on demand-side management to reduce the demand for energy. And by 2030, we reduce greenhouse gases by 50%. We hit the Kyoto target along the way, and we are able to reduce our demand for electricity to such an extent that in Canada, we would have enough existing hydropower, no new dams. We'd have enough existing hydro that we could shut down all the coal plants and all the nuclear reactors. Yeah. We'd shut them all down. It goes through a series, it goes through every sector by sector. This is on our website. It's a very exciting strategy for us because as an organization in Canada, we've been working for nuclear phase out. We've been working to get rid of coal. We've been working to get people to understand what's wrong with our transportation system and how we have to have greater fuel economy and different kinds of vehicles and different kinds of engines and different attitude altogether to the very essence of energy. We don't need big mega projects, long transmissions lines. We don't want the oil and gas companies anymore. Right now, a lot of Canadian wilderness is endangered by the Bush-Cheney Enron energy strategy because we're here to let as much of it be dug up and shipped south as possible. So we're fighting actions to protect the foothills of Alberta. They're digging and drilling oil and gas wells all through Alberta, into Canada's north, into our ocean ecosystems, particularly in Atlantic Canada, because we still have a moratorium in BC. We have a lot of reasons related to biodiversity, wilderness, clean air, and everything else to get the U.S. on a conservation strategy. Ultimately, what we really need is to have the U.S. join in with the rest of the world community, join back in the Kyoto Protocol and join back in the negotiations that will follow it. We really don't have any choices here. It's not as if we can come up with a better plan than Kyoto. That's the plan we've got internationally. That's the plan we're using. And the next step will be deeper and better and stronger. And fortunately, I do think that with the kind of strong grassroots activism that we have across Canada and the US through the Sierra Club, we can really make this happen. we can educate our neighbors, we can educate our friends, and we can get in the United States to where we now are in Canada. Not that we're perfect, I mean, I don't want to sound smug about this, but at least when our politicians stand up and talk about why we need Kyoto, they say because look at the drought in the prairie. We don't want this, we don't want to see another farm family going under because they can't afford to feed their cattle. Look at the forest fires in northern Alberta. Look at what's happened. Canada's forests have become, they have shifted in the last decade from a net sink for carbon dioxide to a net source because of forest fire and insect. So the warming environment has already had that positive feedback loop of turning our forests into a source for carbon. Right? Our politicians are much more comfortable, even the mainstream ones, I'm not talking about the Alliance Party here, but you know, when the Prime Minister of Canada, who is, as far as I was concerned, you know, sort of a Neanderthal on environmental issues, but the Prime Minister of Canada has stuck with Kyoto from the moment it was first negotiated. And when Bush said he was out, Cretin maintained he was going to stay in, and Canada would ratify. So we have a political climate here where people talk openly about the connections between what we're seeing in extreme weather events, what we're seeing in floods, what we're seeing in ice storms. The Quebec government, by the way, commissioned its own study of what are the vulnerabilities of that province to climate change. Because the premier of the province at the time, Lucien Bouchard, put two and two together and thought, I've been through two $1 billion economic loss natural events, supposedly natural extreme weather events, in the last 18 months. And then there was the avalanche that wiped out a village in northern Quebec. He looked at the ice storm, he looked at the Saguenay floods, and he commissioned his bureaucrats to do a study of the vulnerability of the province to extreme weather events and climate change. We're all vulnerable. We're all at risk. But we have the power to change that. If we don't change the great North American lifestyle to something that isn't killing this planet, then we have bequeathed to our children a future that none of us even bear thinking about. So I'm begging you, actually, for those of you who are on this side of the border, make sure we don't leave a stone unturned, don't rest a moment till we get Kyoto ratified and get a plan to achieve the kind of reductions that we know we can do, that are reachable, achievable, meaningful, and take us way past Kyoto to clean air, to a post-fossil fuel world. And since I've been fairly depressing, I do want to end on one upbeat note. Believe it or not, I want to quote someone from Shell International. So we still boycott Shell, but still. The head of the hydrogen division of Shell International said, you know, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the fossil fuel era will not end because we ran out of fossil fuels. I will finish the statement for him. The fossil fuel era will end because of the Sierra Club.